December 7, 1943. Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly under a scorching sun, its surface deceptively calm. Beneath the crystalline waters, coral reefs form natural barriers around a speck of land no larger than New York's Central Park. The air hangs thick with humidity and the metallic scent of approaching warfare. Palm fronds rustle in the trade winds, their gentle whisper soon to be drowned by the thunder of naval guns and the screams of dying men. On this narrow strip of coral and sand, barely 3 miles long and half a mile wide, the fate of the Pacific War would pivot on a single, devastating miscalculation. The Japanese had fortified Tarawa with the confidence of men who believed they had built the perfect fortress. For nearly 2 years, Admiral Keiji Shibasaki and his garrison of 4,800 elite troops had transformed this tropical paradise into what they proudly called the most fortified atoll in the Pacific. Concrete bunkers, reinforced with steel and coral, dotted the landscape like deadly mushrooms. Anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward from camouflaged positions. Coastal artillery pieces, some captured from Singapore's fallen British garrison, commanded every approach. The lagoon had been ringed with obstacles, concrete tetrahedrons, barbed wire, and mines that could tear the bottom from any landing craft foolish enough to attempt an assault. But it was the tanks that filled the Japanese officers with particular satisfaction. Hidden beneath carefully constructed sand berms and camouflaged with palm fronds and coral debris, 14 Type 95 Hago light tanks waited in ambush positions around the airfield. These machines, veterans of campaigns in China and Malaya, represented the cutting edge of Japanese armored warfare. Their 37mm guns had proven devastatingly effective against Chinese infantry and British colonial forces. To the Japanese defenders, these steel beasts were the ace up their sleeve, the surprise that would shatter any American assault before it could gain a foothold on their impregnable island. Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto, commander of the tank squadron, had personally supervised the positioning of each vehicle. Standing in the turret of his command tank, he surveyed the killing ground with professional satisfaction. The Americans, he knew, would come in their predictable fashion, waves of Marines charging across the reef in their flimsy landing craft, vulnerable and exposed. His tanks would emerge from their sandy lairs like mechanical dragons, spitting fire and death. The coral would run red with American blood, and Tarawa would become another Gallipoli, a graveyard of imperial ambition that would teach the Americans the true cost of challenging the empire of the rising sun. The Japanese officers gathered in Admiral Shibasaki's command bunker shared this confidence. Maps covered the concrete walls, marked with defensive positions and firing coordinates. Radio reports crackled with updates from observation posts scattered across the atoll. Intelligence summaries, passed down from Imperial Naval Headquarters in Tokyo, painted a picture of American military capability that seemed almost laughable. The Yankees, the reports suggested, were soft, industrial warriors who relied too heavily on their machines and lacked the spiritual strength of the Japanese soldier. Their tanks, according to these assessments, were heavy, cumbersome beasts designed for the open battlefields of Europe, utterly unsuited for the confined spaces and coral terrain of Pacific atolls. How could these pampered Americans, raised on Hollywood movies and Coca-Cola, stand against the Bushido spirit of soldiers who had sworn to die for their emperor? The question hung in the humid air of the bunker, answered by knowing smiles and confident nods. The Americans had shown some capability in their recent victories at Guadalcanal and Bougainville, but those had been jungle campaigns where superior numbers and industrial production could compensate for lack of fighting spirit. Tarawa would be different. Here, on this fortress of coral and concrete, the true test would come. Spirit would triumph over steel, and the advance across the Pacific would end in the shallow waters of the lagoon. The Japanese had studied American tactics with meticulous care. Intelligence reports described the Marines' preference for frontal assaults, their tendency to rely on overwhelming firepower rather than tactical finesse. The Americans, the reports concluded, were like their tanks, powerful but predictable, dangerous in open battle but vulnerable when forced to fight on terrain not of their choosing. Tarawa's coral reefs and narrow beaches would funnel the assault into predetermined killing zones where Japanese artillery and small arms fire could exact a terrible toll. And when the surviving Marines finally reached the beach, exhausted and disorganized, the hidden tanks would finish them. What the Japanese officers could not know, could not possibly imagine as they shared sake and spoke of glorious death, was that beneath the sand of distant islands, in the industrial heartland of America, a revolution in warfare was taking shape. In the factories of Detroit, where automotive assembly lines had been converted to military production, engineers were solving problems that Japanese military doctrine had never contemplated. The Americans were not simply building more tanks, they were reimagining what a tank could be. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of American armored forces, had indeed proven its worth on the battlefields of North Africa and Italy. But American military planners, blessed with resources that seemed infinite compared to Japan's strained war economy, were not content with a single solution. They were developing specialized variants for specific challenges: flamethrower tanks for bunker warfare, mine-clearing tanks for obstacle removal, amphibious tanks for beach assaults. Each modification represented not just technological innovation, but a fundamental philosophy of warfare that the Japanese had failed to grasp. The American way of war was not about spiritual superiority or individual heroism, but about applying the right tool to the right problem with overwhelming effectiveness. The M4A2 Shermans that would soon appear on Tarawa's beaches were not the same machines that had fought Rommel in the desert. These tanks had been modified specifically for Pacific warfare, equipped with additional armor to deflect small arms, fire, improved cooling systems to handle tropical heat, and most importantly, specially designed tracks and suspension systems that could navigate coral terrain without bogging down in sand. American engineers had studied the coral atolls with the same methodical precision that Japanese officers had applied to their fortifications. Every beach gradient, every coral formation, every tidal variation had been catalogued and analyzed. But the true innovation lay not in the tanks themselves, but in how they would be used. American tactical doctrine had evolved beyond the simple frontal assault that Japanese intelligence reports described. The Marines approaching Tarawa would employ a combined arms approach that integrated tanks, artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support in ways that Japanese defensive planning had never anticipated. Each Sherman would be accompanied by specially trained infantry squads equipped with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and portable radios that could call down precision fire support within minutes. The Japanese defenders, despite their careful preparations, had made a critical error in their strategic thinking. They had prepared to fight the last war, not the next one. Their defensive positions, while formidable against the tactics of 1941, were poorly suited to resist the integrated assault techniques that American forces had perfected through bitter experience in the Solomon Islands. The hidden tanks that represented Japan's secret weapon were positioned to counter a conventional beach assault, not the adaptive, multi-layered attack that was actually coming. As dawn broke on November 20th, 1943, the first signs of American presence appeared on the horizon. Naval vessels, more numerous than any the Japanese had imagined possible, began taking position around the atoll. The bombardment that followed exceeded every defensive calculation. For hours, 16-inch naval guns and aerial bombs pulverized the coral fortress, turning concrete bunkers into rubble and palm trees into splinters. The carefully camouflaged tank positions, hidden beneath their sandy berms, shook under explosions that registered on seismographs thousands of miles away. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto, crouched in his command tank as shells screamed overhead, began to understand that something was terribly wrong with their intelligence assessments. The volume of firepower being brought to bear exceeded anything in Japanese military experience. Radio communications with forward observation posts went silent one by one as direct hits obliterated positions that had been considered impregnable. The American fleet visible through his periscope seemed to stretch to the horizon. Not the modest task force that intelligence had predicted, but an armada that suggested resources beyond Japanese comprehension. When the first wave of landing craft approached the reef, Japanese artillery and machine gun positions that had survived the bombardment opened fire with desperate intensity. The water churned with explosions and tracer fire as Marines waded through the lagoon, many falling before they reached the beach. For a moment, it seemed as though the defensive plan was working. The Americans were taking heavy casualties, their advance stalled by the coral obstacles and concentrated defensive fire. In his bunker, Admiral Shibasaki permitted himself a moment of satisfaction. The Americans were bleeding, just as predicted. But as the morning wore on, the nature of the American assault became clear. These were not the soft industrial warriors of Japanese propaganda, but hardened veterans who adapted to each defensive obstacle with methodical determination. Small units of Marines, using tactics learned in jungle warfare, began infiltrating Japanese positions from unexpected angles. Navy combat engineers, working under fire, cleared channels through the coral obstacles that Japanese planners had considered impassable. And most ominously, radio reports began reaching the command bunker of strange American vehicles approaching the beach. Not the heavy, cumbersome tanks that intelligence had described, but sleek, purpose-built machines that seemed designed specifically for this type of warfare. The first M4A2 Sherman to emerge from the lagoon onto Tarawa's sand sent shockwaves through the Japanese defensive network. This was not the predictable frontal assault that their tactics were designed to counter. The American tank moved with surprising agility across the coral terrain, its specially modified tracks gripping surfaces that should have been impassable. Behind it came Marines who fought with a coordination and tactical sophistication that belied every stereotype about American military capability. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto ordered his hidden tanks to reveal themselves and engage. The first Type 95 Heigo emerged from its sandy camouflage with a roar of engine noise and a spray of coral debris. Its 37mm gun, which had been so effective against Chinese infantry and British colonial forces, fired its first round at the approaching Sherman. The shell struck the American tank's sloped armor and bounced harmlessly into the lagoon. The return fire from the Sherman's 75mm gun was immediate and devastating. The Hago exploded in a ball of flame and twisted metal, its ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions that sent debris raining across the beach. In that moment, as the smoke cleared and revealed the burning wreckage of their most advanced armored vehicle, the Japanese officers on Tarawa began to understand the magnitude of their miscalculation. The Americans had not simply built more tanks, they had built better tanks, designed specifically to counter Japanese defensive tactics. The Type 95 Heigo, which had seemed so formidable in the jungles of Malaya and the plains of China, was obsolete against opponents who had learned from every previous engagement and adapted their equipment accordingly. One by one, the hidden Japanese tanks revealed themselves and died. Each engagement followed the same pattern: the emergence from camouflage, the initial ineffective shot, the devastating American response. The 37mm guns that had terrorized Chinese peasants and colonial troops proved utterly inadequate against the Sherman's armor. Meanwhile, the American 75mm guns, firing high-explosive rounds that had been specifically designed for bunker warfare, turned Japanese steel into scrap metal with methodical efficiency. But the true revelation came not in the destruction of individual tanks, but in the systematic way the Americans dismantled the entire defensive network. The Shermans did not operate in isolation, as Japanese tactical doctrine assumed they would. Instead, they formed the centerpiece of integrated combat teams that combined armored firepower with infantry assault, engineer support, and precision artillery. When a Sherman encountered a particularly stubborn bunker, radio calls would bring down naval gunfire or airstrikes with devastating accuracy. When coral obstacles blocked their advance, specialized engineer vehicles appeared to clear the way. When Japanese defenders attempted to counterattack, Marine infantry squads would emerge from positions that had been invisible moments before. The symbolic weight of this technological and tactical superiority was not lost on the surviving Japanese defenders. Throughout the empire, from the home islands to the conquered territories of Southeast Asia, Japanese propaganda had emphasized the spiritual and moral superiority of their forces over the materialistic Americans. The samurai spirit, the willingness to die for the emperor, the purity of Japanese racial heritage, these were the weapons that would triumph over American industrial might. Tarawa shattered these comforting myths with brutal finality. The Americans fighting their way across the coral were not the soft, decadent enemies of Japanese imagination. They were professionals who had learned their craft through bitter experience and adapted their methods to each new challenge. Their equipment was not simply more numerous than Japanese equivalents, it was more sophisticated, more reliable, and more specifically designed for the task at hand. The Sherman tanks that methodically reduced Japanese positions to rubble represented not just superior industrial capacity, but superior military thinking. As the battle progressed, the sound that came to dominate the acoustic landscape of Tarawa was not the crack of rifle fire or the boom of artillery, but the steady mechanical rumble of American tanks moving across coral terrain that Japanese engineers had considered impassable. Each Sherman that appeared represented not just a weapon, but a symbol of American abundance and technological innovation. Where Japanese forces had 14 light tanks hidden across the entire atoll, the Americans seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply of armored vehicles, each one purpose-built for specific tactical requirements. The Marines following behind the Shermans carried equipment that further emphasized the gulf between American and Japanese military resources. Their individual weapons were not necessarily superior to Japanese equivalents, but they possessed them in abundance. Ammunition was plentiful enough to be used liberally. Radio communications linked every unit to supporting fires and logistical support. Medical supplies and evacuation procedures ensured that casualties received treatment that would have been considered miraculous by Japanese standards. Food, water, and replacement equipment flowed across the beach in quantities that seemed to violate every principle of military logistics that Japanese officers had been taught. For Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto, trapped in his command tank as American forces systematically destroyed his squadron, the battle became a revelation about the true nature of the Pacific War. This was not a conflict between equals where superior spirit could compensate for material disadvantage. This was a contest between an industrial democracy that could afford to design specialized equipment for every conceivable tactical situation, and an empire that was already straining its resources to maintain basic military operations. The American tanks advancing across Tarawa were not simply weapons, they were manifestations of a society that could afford to send its best equipment and most thoroughly trained personnel to capture a coral atoll that most Americans could not locate on a map. Each Sherman represented thousands of hours of design work, months of specialized manufacturing, extensive crew training, and a logistical network that could deliver fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to any point in the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese Empire, despite its early victories and territorial expansion, could not match this level of systematic military capability. As his tank's ammunition ran low and American forces closed in on his position, Yamamoto found himself contemplating questions that Japanese military doctrine had never encouraged. If the Americans could bring such overwhelming force to bear on a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific, what would they be capable of when they reached the main Japanese island chains? If their industrial capacity could produce specialized variants of tanks for every conceivable tactical situation, how could Japanese forces, equipped with weapons designed in the 1930s and manufactured with increasingly scarce materials, hope to compete? The sound of American tank treads on coral became, in the final hours of the battle, something like the heartbeat of inevitability. Each grinding revolution brought the Pacific War closer to its predetermined conclusion. The Japanese officers who had laughed at American tanks were learning, in the most brutal way possible, that their laughter had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about both American capabilities and the nature of modern warfare. Admiral Shibasaki, in his command bunker as it shook under the impact of American shells, radioed his final message to Imperial Naval Headquarters. Enemy tanks have penetrated all defensive positions. Our forces are fighting to the last man, but the Americans possess equipment and tactics for which we were not prepared. Tarawa will fall within hours. The Empire must prepare for a long war against an enemy whose capabilities exceed all previous estimates. The Admiral's words, transmitted across thousands of miles of ocean to reach Japan's military leadership, carried implications that extended far beyond the fate of a single coral atoll. The easy victories of 1941 and 1942, when Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific against colonial troops equipped with obsolete weapons and limited air support, had created dangerous illusions about American military potential. Tarawa revealed the reality. The United States possessed not only superior industrial capacity, but superior military innovation, tactical flexibility, and strategic thinking. The specialized Sherman tanks that dominated Tarawa's coral landscape represented a broader American approach to warfare that Japanese military planners had failed to anticipate. While Japanese forces had prepared to fight variations of conflicts they had already won, American military leaders had studied each engagement, identified deficiencies in their equipment and tactics, and developed solutions specifically tailored to Pacific warfare. The result was not simply numerical superiority, but qualitative advantages that made Japanese defensive preparations irrelevant. In the final hours of the battle, as the last Japanese positions were systematically reduced to rubble, the symbolic significance of the American victory became clear to survivors on both sides. The tanks that had seemed so laughably inappropriate for atoll warfare had proven devastatingly effective. The Americans, who had been dismissed as soft industrial warriors, had fought with professional competence that exceeded Japanese elite units. The Empire of the Rising Sun, which had built its military doctrine on assumptions of racial and spiritual superiority, had been outfought by democratic soldiers who approached warfare as a technical problem to be solved through superior equipment and training. The M4A2 Shermans that stood victorious among the wreckage of Tarawa's defenses were more than weapons. They were symbols of a society that could afford to design specialized solutions for every military challenge. Each tank represented not just superior industrial capacity, but superior systematic thinking about the requirements of modern warfare. The Americans had not simply built more tanks. They had built the right tanks for the specific challenges of Pacific combat. As the sun set on November 23, 1943, over the captured atoll, the grinding sound of American tank treads continued as engineers cleared wreckage and prepared defensive positions. The coral that had been intended as Japan's impregnable fortress had become another stepping stone in America's advance across the Pacific. The tanks that Japanese officers had dismissed with contemptuous laughter had proven to be harbingers of a new kind of warfare that would carry American forces to the gates of Japan itself. The strategic implications of Tarawa's fall rippled across the Pacific like shock waves from an underwater explosion. Japanese military planners, studying the reports from survivors, were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their enemy's capabilities. The Americans were not simply producing more weapons. They were producing better weapons, designed by engineers who understood Pacific warfare better than Japanese commanders who had actually fought in it. The Sherman tanks that had proven so effective on Tarawa were already being modified and improved for the next phase of the campaign. In the steel mills of Pittsburgh and the assembly plants of Detroit, American industry was retooling for the long advance across the Pacific. Each lesson learned at Tarawa would be incorporated into new designs, new tactics, new training programs. The Japanese Empire, struggling to replace the losses from a single atoll, would face an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each engagement. The laughter that had greeted reports of American tank capabilities had died in the coral dust of Tarawa, replaced by the sobering recognition that the Pacific War had become a contest, that Japan could not win. The hidden tanks that were supposed to be Japan's secret weapon had revealed. Instead, the secret of American military success, the ability to adapt, innovate, and apply overwhelming force with precision and effectiveness. The sand that had concealed Japanese armor had been swept away to reveal the true nature of the conflict. Not a clash between spiritual warriors and industrial weaklings, but a struggle between a military philosophy based on past victories and one based on continuous improvement and adaptation. For the Marines who had fought their way across Tarawa's coral beaches, the victory represented vindication of months of specialized training and equipment development. The tanks that had carried them to victory were not simply machines, but manifestations of a democratic society's commitment to protecting its values through superior preparation and professional competence. Each Sherman that had proven its worth in the battle would become the prototype for improved models that would carry the fight to Japan's doorstep. The Japanese officers who had survived Tarawa's destruction carried with them, across the Pacific, the sobering knowledge that their enemy possessed capabilities that exceeded their most pessimistic estimates. The Americans were not the predictable, materially dependent weaklings of propaganda, but adaptable professionals who approached each challenge with systematic analysis and purpose-built solutions. The tanks that had seemed so unsuitable for atoll warfare had been specifically designed for exactly such combat, representing a level of military planning and industrial coordination that Japan could not match. As American forces prepared for the next phase of their advance across the Central Pacific, the lessons of Tarawa were already being incorporated into new equipment designs and tactical doctrines. The specialized Sherman variants that had proven so effective would be joined by even more sophisticated machines. Amphibious tanks for beach assaults, flamethrower tanks for bunker warfare, engineering tanks for obstacle clearance. Each new design represented not just technological innovation, but strategic thinking that looked beyond the immediate battle to the ultimate objective of defeating Japan. The coral reefs of Tarawa, stained with the blood of both sides, had become a laboratory for testing the weapons and tactics that would decide the Pacific War. The Japanese, defenders who had prepared so carefully for the assault they expected, had been destroyed by the assault that actually came, one that combined superior equipment, innovative tactics, and overwhelming material support in ways that Japanese military doctrine had never contemplated. Their sacrifice had purchased knowledge, but knowledge that came too late to alter the war's trajectory. The American tanks that had dominated Tarawa's battlefields represented more than military hardware. They embodied the industrial democracy's approach to warfare as a problem to be solved through superior resources, better planning, and continuous adaptation. Each Sherman had been designed not by individual genius, but by teams of engineers working with unlimited access to materials, testing facilities, and combat experience from previous engagements. The result was weapons systems that exceeded Japanese equivalents not through single innovations, but through systematic superiority in every aspect of design and production. In nouns to puanit round fuan and under titteriturf. The months that followed Tarawa's capture, the strategic balance in the Pacific shifted inexorably toward the advancing Americans. The Japanese Empire, forced to acknowledge that its most carefully prepared defenses could be overcome by American tactical and technological superiority, began the long retreat that would end in the home islands. The tanks that had emerged from beneath Tarawa's sand had revealed the true nature of the conflict. Not a test of spiritual strength or racial superiority, but a contest between different approaches to organizing industrial societies for warfare. The grinding sound of American tank treads on coral, which had dominated the acoustic landscape of Tarawa's final battle, became the soundtrack of Japan's defeat in the Pacific. Each engagement that followed would reinforce the lessons learned in the lagoon, that American forces possessed not only superior numbers, but superior equipment, training, and tactical doctrine. The specialized weapons that had proven so effective at Tarawa would be refined and improved for each subsequent assault, creating a cycle of innovation that Japanese industry, operating under increasing resource constraints, could not match. The hidden Japanese tanks that had been revealed and destroyed beneath Tarawa's sand became symbols of a military philosophy that looked to the past for guidance in fighting future wars. The American Shermans that had methodically hunted them down represented a different approach, one that assumed continuous improvement, systematic analysis of tactical problems, and unlimited access to the industrial resources necessary to implement solutions. In the coral dust and twisted metal of Tarawa's battlefield, the outcome of the Pacific War had been determined not by individual courage or tactical brilliance, but by the superior organizational capabilities of democratic industrialism. As the Pacific War moved toward its inevitable conclusion, the laughter that had once greeted American military capabilities gave way to grim recognition of unstoppable force. The tanks that had seemed so poorly suited for atoll warfare had proven perfectly adapted to their mission, representing a level of specialized preparation that Japanese forces could neither match nor counter. The sand beneath which Japanese armor had waited in ambush had been swept away to reveal the fundamental truth of modern warfare, that victory belonged not to the spiritually pure or racially superior, but to those who could most effectively combine industrial capacity with tactical innovation and strategic vision. In the end, the coral atolls of the Central Pacific had become stepping stones not just for American military advance, but for a transformation in warfare itself. The specialized tanks that had dominated Tarawa's beaches represented the emergence of military systems designed not for past conflicts, but for the specific challenges of future campaigns. The Japanese officers who had once laughed at American tanks had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that their laughter had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about both their enemies, capabilities, and the nature of modern warfare itself. The Sherman tanks that stood victorious among Tarawa's ruins were more than weapons. They were harbingers of a new kind of warfare that would carry American democracy across the Pacific to victory over an empire that had fatally underestimated both the material and moral resources of its enemy. The sand that had hidden Japanese armor had been blown away to reveal the bedrock truth of the conflict, that in the crucible of total war, democratic industrialism possessed advantages that no amount of spiritual preparation or racial mythology could overcome.